What's up, guys? It's Kyle. And today I wanted to review my first chapter of my book called Kinesics. My book, of course, is called Expert Expression and Masterclass on Communication. Here we go. Body language is the study of bodily movements. Kinesics is the study of how body language generate gestures serve as a form of nonverbal communication. Body language is differentiated in linguistics as the word language is specifically about a written or verbal form of communication. So it's inaccurate to call body language language because linguistically it's not. Kinesics is the nonverbal code system of body activity. It was in 1964 that the anthropologist Ray Birdwhistell published a book, Lecture on Kinesics, by Ray L. Birdwhistell at the Second Linguistics Kinesic Conference, November 4th through 7th in 1964. A documentary work based on 2 lectures on kinesics, which he gave to a conference of senior research scientists, including linguists, psychiatrists, anthropologists, and psychologists. In his work, he posited 6 assumptions: that all intentional body movement has meaning potential, that meaning potentially communicative context behavior can be analyzed in terms of patterns and repetitions. Although nonverbal communication has biological limits, the use of body motion in interaction is part of the social system. People's visual bodily activity can influence others. Communicative function of body activity can be studied, therefore, and a person's use of body activity will have a unique idiosyncratic aspect, which is unique to them, as well as being part of a larger social system of body language shared by others. In 1969, Paul Ekman, an American psychologist and professor emeritus at the University of California, San Francisco, who was a pioneer of the study of emotions and their relation to facial expressions, as well as Walter Friesen from the University of California, San Francisco, published a work that said that there are 5 types of nonverbal behavior. These include emblems, affect displays, regulators, and manipulators. Illustrators are those body language signs which accompany or reinforce verbal messages. They include batons, which accent through time words or phrases, ideographs, which trace the paths of mental journeys, deictic movements, which point to a present object, kinetographs, which depict a bodily action, spatial movements, which depict a spatial relationship, pictographs, which draw a picture of that to which they refer, and rhythmic movements, which depict the rhythm or pacing of an event. Affect displays are those displays which show emotion. Regulators control the flow and pace of communication. Manipulators release physical or emotional tension. Emblems. Emblems are body movements or gestures which have a precise meaning. That is, they can be linguistically expressed in their meaning. Emblems, said Ekman, may repeat a word as it is said, and replace a word in a flow of speech, provide a separate comment related to the words spoken, or occur as the sole reply. Emblems may be iconic, in which movements look in some way like the message they are signifying, or arbitrarily coded. Emblems most often involve the hands, but some are performed using the shoulders, changes in head position, or facial movements. Emblems are typically performed in the presentation position, which is directly in front of the performer, between the waist and the head, as such. They usually have a staccato or punctuated appearance, with a sudden beginning and ending. The performer is as aware of using an emblem as he or she is of the words being spoken. Some basic emblems are nodding of one's head to indicate yes, the finger, which I won't show because I would have to blur it out, a wave, as to say hello. However, such a gesture as a handshake would not be considered an emblem because linguistically it cannot be expressed directly. Illustrators. We, according to Paul Ekman, coined this term to refer to movements that illustrate speech. They are intimately related to the speaker's speech on a moment-to-moment basis, usually augmenting what is said, but sometimes contradicting it. Batons time out, accent, or emphasize a particular word or phrase. They beat out the tempo of mental locomotion. Ideographs sketch a path or directing of thought, tracing the itinerary of a logical journey. Deictic movements point to a typically present object. Hold on one second. Deictic movements point to a present object. Kinetographs depict a bodily action. Spatial movements depict a spatial relationship. Pictographs draw a picture of their referent. And rhythmic movements depict the rhythm or pacing of an event. Affect displays are displays of body language which show emotion. Regulators control the flow and pace of communication. Manipulators release physical or emotional tension. Emblems are emblems. Emblems are body movements or gestures which have a precise meaning. That is, they can be linguistically expressed in their meaning. Emblems may represent a word as it is said, replace a word in a flow of speech, provide a separate comment related to the words spoken, or occur as the sole reply. I already read that. These illustrators are typically performed with the hands, and this is about illustrators, the six forms of body movement that I just read about before reading about emblems for the second time. These illustrators are typically performed with the hands, although the head may be involved or even the feet. I made these distinctions when I had been studying bodily movement, according to Ekman in 1979. After another decade of measuring facial muscular movement, I noticed I'm scrolling through my book. I noticed that certain facial movements can be used as batons, and that this category can be subdivided. There are facial as well as bodily batons that accent a word. These baton accents typically co-occur with an increase in loudness. There are also baton underliers that emphasize a phrase. We have found it's nearly impossible to deliberately disconnect the change in loudness and the baton accent. We have not found anyone who, within a phrase, can deliberately increase loudness on one word and place the baton accent on another word without unintentionally increasing the loudness of the baton accented word. Nearly all of the facial batons involve either brow raising or brow lowering, although it's possible to use nearly any facial movement for this purpose. Brow raising and brow lowering are highly visible facial movements and movements that we have found are easy to perform, even by young children. Although some individuals utilize raising more than lower, or vice versa. For most people, the facial movement deployed as a baton accent is related to the content of the word being emphasized. With words such as easy, light, good, etc., a brow raise is used, while brow lower is used to emphasize words such as difficult, dark, bad, or other negative words. If a person tries to brow lower to emphasize words such as light or good, the voice sounds strange and their performance seems rough. I offer two non-exclusive explanations for the association of brow lower and brow raise with negative and positive words. Brow lowering, which is employed in a variety of negative emotions, such as fear, sadness, distress, or anger, should carry an implication of something negative, whereas brow raising would be more likely to express surprise or interest. Alternatively, the role played by these two actions in conversational signals would thus be viewed as analogs to their biological adaptive value. Either possibility could be true. In unpublished research with Linda Cameras, described more in Ekman's book, which he published in 1979, we found that brow lowering and raising is also used in quite different ways in statements which ask a question. If the speaker is going to use a brow movement at all, then it is likely that the brows will be raised if the speaker knows the answer to the question, and lowered if the speaker does not know the answer. One of the editors of this volume suggested that this contrasts with the use of brows in signing. In many sign languages, American Sign Language among them, raised brows are part of the signal for yes or no questions. Lowered brows are part of the signal for questions which start in the WH prefix, when, why, what. However, raised brows are also part of the signal for rhetorical questions, which in keeping with our findings on non-signers. The tone of voice and pitch level will also differ with these two types of questions. Illustrators are socially learned, presumably when language itself is learned. It's been dramatically demonstrated that immigrant Lithuanian Jews and Sicilians are very different types of illustrators, but these differences were not preserved in their offspring who assimilated into the mainstream of New York City culture. Although individuals differ in both the type and frequency with which they use illustrators, there are also individual variations. Illustrators increase with the speaker's involvement with the process of speaking, with both positive and negative effect, and decrease with lowered involvement, such as boredom or fatigue. A decrease in illustrators also occurs when a person is carefully weighing each word before it is spoken. Although this may occur with caution or ambivalence, it's also been proven to be a useful indicator of deception. We found that illustrators increased when depressed patients recovered. Illustrators help explain what is being said verbally. They can also serve a self-priming function, helping the speaker get going or get through a difficult to explain thought. Illustrators command the listener's attention and can help hold the floor for the speaker. We found that the use of illustrators impresses others as a sign of sociability and friendliness. I expect students would retain more information from a lecturer who uses illustrators, but I don't have research to support this speculation. Manipulators. Manipulators were originally called adapters, but now the more descriptive term manipulators is used. In these movements, one part of the body or face manipulates in some fashion, whether stroking, pressing, scratching, licking, biting, sucking, etc., another part of the body or face. An object may also be the object of this attention or used to perform the manipulation. The frequency with which these movements occur is amazing once one begins to notice them, not just in private but also in public. People usually touch themselves. One of my favorite classroom exercises is to ask the students to put down everything and stop touching themselves. It is hard for them to maintain this for even 5 minutes. Scrolling. Sorry to make you wait. While some of these manipulators appear to accomplish grooming or cleaning, many of them seem to have no instrumental goal. Perhaps reassurance or comforting is a possibility, but many manipulators seem to reflect a nervousness simply or habitual activity. Manipulators seem to be performed on the edge of awareness, in that a person, if asked what he or she just did, can usually describe the activity, but was not focusing on it as it occurred. Our observation suggests that most people disattend when another person engages in a particularly noticeable, presumably tattoo manipulator such as ear or nose cleaning. This disattending, it is believed, also occurs with little awareness. Individuals differ not only in their favored manipulator, but also in the frequency with which they show these behaviors. They often increase with increasing discomfort, and although some people show a decrease and freeze into a tense, restrained position when uncomfortable. Manipulators may increase when people are totally comfortable with friends, not worrying at all about appearances. Research found that others distrust people who show many manipulators. They're commonly interpreted as signs someone is lying, but in fact they're not a reliable sign of lying for most people. Regulators. We coined this term to draw attention to actions which maintain and regulate the back and forth nature of speaking and listening between two or more interactants. They tell the speaker to continue, repeat, elaborate, hurry up, become more interesting, less salacious, give the other a chance to talk, etc. They tell the listener to pay special attention, to wait just a minute more to talk, etc. While illustrators and emblems and emotional expressions, which I describe next, influence and may also be said to regulate the flow of conversation, I use the term regulator to refer to when those or other actions are primarily functioning for just this purpose alone. Sheffin, in his 1963 through 1965 work, wrote about regulators. although that is not what he called them, and made many important contributions such as the role of postural shifts and mirroring. Did not focus on regulators very much, and his observations were limited. Listener responses were first described, I believe, by Dittman in 1972. He focused on a variety of movements that lead the speaker to continue with what he is saying. These may include head nods, agreement smiles, forward leans, brow raises in exclamation, and so forth. I call these agreement listener responses to distinguish them from another set, which is calls for information. The listener may lower the brow to signal a lack of understanding or puzzlement with what has been said. A brow raise may indicate disbelief or that what has been said is incredible. I described earlier, but did not before name floor holders, responses made by a speaker to prevent interruptions. I've seen this done by holding a hand out, just like a traffic policeman, to prevent the listener from entering the conversation just yet. Turn seekers are the listener's attempts to gain the floor, which may involve such diverse actions as leaning forward, almost rising from a chair, beginning to make the lip motion for speech, or other motions. Emotional expressions. Originally, the term affect display was used, but each one of these words carries surplus meaning. Affect implies more than one emotion. It encompasses a broader range of phenomena, such as moods. And display is no better word than expression, which I prefer in deference to Darwin. Also, the use of the term expression serves to raise the issue, which has bothered many ethologists, of whether these movements on the face are communicative actions or expressions. This is a false and misleading dichotomy. I maintain that emotional expressions are involuntary signals which provide important information to others. These expressions have been selected and refined over the course of evolution for their role in social communication. As involuntary signals, they may occur in response to anything that calls forth an emotion, which may include non-personal events such as a beautiful sunset or thunder, and they may be manifest when the individual is alone. The presence of others enhances expressions, as emotions themselves evolve primarily to deal with fundamental life tasks involving childcare, mating, dealing with predators and rivals, etc. It's reasonable to call these signals expressions because they're part of an emotion. They're a sign that an emotion is occurring. I have maintained that a hallmark of emotion is that it has a signal in face, voice, or bodily movement. There's no involuntary signal which informs conspecifics what the person is thinking. Thoughts are private, while emotions are not. Elsewhere, I've described 9 characteristics which distinguish emotions from reflexes, moods, affective traits, and affective disorders. I think that it is a reasonable assumption that any state which shares the characteristics I described for an emotion will have a signal. But that is only a description, not sacred theory waiting to be challenged by the evidence of secret emotion, which has all the other characteristics of the signal emotions. We do not know much about what people actually derive when they see or hear an expression in the course of a conversation, competing with other sources of information and embedded in one or another context of previous and simultaneous behaviors and various expectations. From the research that's been done by removing an expression from context and asking people who are not involved in the situation to make judgments, we know that emotional expressions can provide information about the antecedent events and about single emotional items. I have proposed that emotional expressions may also convey information about likely next actions, likely thoughts and plans, the internal state of the expressor, which may be in terms of a metaphor what the observer might be thinking it would be wise to do next. While the emotional expressions are not learned, we do learn what we term display rules to manage emotions. These rules are to some extent individually and culturally variable. Specify who can show which emotion to whom and when. Individuals differ in their success in inhibiting, substituting, masking, or magnifying. My evidence and the evidence of many others support Darwin's claim that these expressions are universal to our species, and some of them are shared with other species. Social constructionists, culture relativists, and those focused on the language of emotions still argue with this claim. Words are not emotions, but representations of emotion. The fact that a language does not have a word for an emotion does not mean that the emotion does not exist for the speakers of that language, but that it has not been labeled with a single word. English speakers can enjoy the suffering of their enemies, but they have no single word no single term for it. While Germans have the word Schadenfreude, perhaps the mistaken belief that words are emotions, or the most important feature of an emotion, arose because of most of the cross-cultural research, but not all. Ask people in different cultures to choose a single emotion word for each face they were shown. While this did not produce very strong agreement across cultures, it was not perfect, for single words do not translate exactly from one language to another. Another technique, still involving words, was to use a story to convey a social context and ask people to indicate which face fit which social context. Again, very high agreement was observed. The face is one of the primary sites of emotional expressions. The voice is the other. I believe posture, the positioning of the head and body, is also recorded into the signal of some of the emotions. Ekman and Friesen in 1978 developed a fine-grained measurement technique for comprehensively describing any facial movement in terms of the particular muscular actions produced. The facial action coding system, or FACS, can be used to describe any observed facial action, not just those which may be relevant to an emotion. They found that even in highly emotional circumstances, that most of the facial movements are not emotional signals, but facial illustrators, primarily batons. A few hundred people have learned FACS and are using it to study pain in infant development, sign language, psychopathology, and psychotherapy, as well as emotion. There's not just one, but a family of facial expressions for each emotion. The family includes variations related to intensity, efforts to control the expression, and perhaps also the particular form of the emotion. Taking anger as an example, there is about intensity variations from annoyance to rage and how to distinguish controlled from uncontrolled anger. But we do not know if there are different expressions for self-righteous anger as opposed to indignant anger. It is not certain how many universal expressions there are. The evidence from the judgment of facial expressions is strong for anger, fear, disgust, contempt, surprise, sadness, distress, and enjoyment. Keltner in 1995 suggested that there may also be a universal expression for embarrassment. The other emotions can be signaled by a face in an instant, a frozen movement, but embarrassment apparently requires the unfolding of a sequence of facial and bodily movements. Paul Ekman suspected that there was an expression for awe, but no one has described it. The evidence from the study of voice has to date not identified any other emotions which have a unique cross-cultural signal. Paul Ekman suggested that there is an unhappiness group of emotions which has a particular facial expression and a happiness group which does so as well. Members of the unhappiness group are sadness, the more agitated version of sadness, distress, guilt, shame, discouragement, and disappointment. His claim is that each of their appearances on the face is not much different, with only minor variations for each of these related states. Perhaps the voice might provide separate signals for these presumed emotions, but research has yet to determine this has not been yet done. The happiness group includes sensory pleasure, pride in achievement, amusement, relief, and contentment. His claim was that all of these share the same facial expression, some variation in zygomatic major in the outer portion of the orbicularis oculi, the muscles 6 and 12 in FACS terms, with only minor variations in the timing of these movements and their strength. Perhaps the voice may provide separate signals for each of these happiness emotions, for it certainly seems obvious that amusement doesn't sound like relief. A referential expression is a facial movement which refers to an emotion that is not felt by the person showing it. The person is referring to the emotion much as the person would with a word, showing the emotion, but in a way that makes it clear that the person is not feeling it now. The referential expression must look like the emotional expression, but differ from it for two reasons. First, it resembles the actual emotion expression the observer might fail to recognize that is not being felt now, and may perceive it as an actual emotional expression. The second reason why it must be transformed is to reduce the likelihood that the person making the referential expression will actually begin to experience emotion. His research with Robert Levinson in 1990 found that deliberately making the facial motions associated with the universal expression generates the changes in the autonomic nervous system that occur when emotion is generated in more typical ways. In subsequent research, he found that deliberately making the facial configuration associated with enjoyment generated many of the changes in the central nervous system which occur when enjoyment occurs spontaneously. The transformations of the actual emotional expression into a referential expression occur both in time and morphology. Typically, the referential expression is either much briefer or much longer than the actual emotional expression and involves only one set of facial movements, not the complete array of facial movements associated with an emotional expression. Common examples are the horizontal stretching of the lips, typically performed very quickly to refer to fear, and the raised upper lip, either brief or very long, to refer to disgust. If you're interested in kinesics, I would highly recommend reading the full versions of these authors' works. Another book I'd recommend, which has more to do with emotional connectedness with kinesics than kinesics itself, is Emotional Intelligence, first published in 1995 by Daniel Goleman. A groundbreaking work in its own right, which has educated many working professionals as well as lay people on the basic working of human emotional cognition as well as the physiological aspect of emotion. Thanks for listening to my chapter, and I hope that you enjoyed it. I will be back in the next few days with my next chapter, which is titled Eye Communication and Eye Behaviors. Anyway, I hope that you got value from this, and I hope that you subscribe to my YouTube channel, which I will put a link to in my profile. And I hope you enjoy your day. Thank you.